How's it going, guys? This is Mighty Imitation, and today I'm just going to quickly give you a little bit of a analysis on the data that has been discovered about the shiny animations. You may know that there are two shiny animations in this game, one being stars and the other being squares, and we've not actually known what the differences are with those animations until now. There might still be a little bit more to discover about these animations, but basically the long and short of it is that they are determined by your ID and the PID of the Pokemon. But to basically just go into Kurt's tweet, and he's a very well-known data miner, he basically says here that shiny Pokemon rarity have been split, same 1496 odds to attain a shiny, but there are two types of shiny. 15 out of 16 show stars, 1 in 16 show squares. Square rarity is 1 in 65,536. Basically, if your ID cleanly matches the PID, it will be squares rather than stars. But then obviously there's more to it than that, because people have been finding in the wild, people have been finding a ton of squares, in fact exclusively squares, but then Kurt goes in to say, in a surprising twist, it looks like chain shinies are destined to be shiny and are forced to be shiny in such a way that the PID results in squares. So under certain conditions, you're more likely to get one than the other. The thing is though, guys, that A-Drive, a very well-known shiny hunter, he put out a video about this just recently, 3 hours ago, and it's actually, there's more to it than that. It's actually kind of very exciting for shiny hunters, especially if you're into full odds, if you're into finding shinies as rare as possible, because it's not just chain shinies, guys, that are forced into squares, and we can see that by going into the next tweet here. You can see that Shiny Collector, he commented basically saying, hey, the random encounters we believe to be full odds also have squared, what's going on? And another data miner, he actually posted a reply underneath Shiny Collector, you can see, which says, full odd stuff is silly. For your sake, wild encounters roll early on to decide if it's shiny. Later, the PID gets generated and the shiny force function is called if it should be shiny. The force function gives squares unless it's already shiny, in which case, stars. This is huge, guys. This basically means that, although it's not very clear, if you look into this in detail, this basically means that there is a almost irrelevant shiny roll originally given on all wild encounters. This is only applicable to wild encounters, and that shiny roll, I say, is mostly irrelevant, because we're going to go into it in a sec, but it's the PID which gives you the shiny. The PID is the personality of the Pokemon. From Generation 3, the PID has always been the thing that gives you the shiny or doesn't. And the PID has to cleanly match with your trainer ID and your secret ID in order to give you the shiny. And just like before, it's the PID here that gives you the shiny, but that's actually generated after this first check, this first early check. We don't know really, like this guy Michael, we don't know what he means exactly by this first check. Or we know that there is one. He's also a well-known data miner himself, but this first check basically doesn't, even if it comes up flags as shiny, it doesn't give you the shiny. It's the PID that, once generated, gives you the shiny for wild encounters. So this basically means that if you're meant to get a shiny, just like any other game, from Generation 3, if the PID comes up as shiny, then there's a force function that occurs, and that force function is what Kurt was talking about in his tweet, that gives you squares. It always 100% gives you squares. So that basically means, guys, that if you're chaining, then if the Pokemon wasn't meant to be shiny and it does those extra rolls and you're chaining and it lands on the shiny, then that means you're going to get squares. If you're not chaining, if you're doing full odds like I do and like a bunch of other hunters do, and you land on the shiny without getting the extra rolls, but it's because of the PID, not the first check, because the first check is irrelevant in this case, then it's still going to be squares. So it doesn't matter whether you're chaining or whether you're not chaining. That's why we've seen all these full odd shinies having squares, all of the chain shinies having squares. Basically all of the shinies in the wild have squares, and it's because of this force function on the PID. So you may be wondering, okay, well, if that's the case, what is the point of this first initial roll? Like, why is there another roll for wild encounters? And the reason for that, if you go into Michael's next tweet, is because the wild Pokemon that were already meant to be shiny from the first check are what gives you the chance of having a wild encounter with stars instead of squares. And you can see he says, from wild encounters you would expect the following ratios: 65,520 out of 65,536 are going to be forced shiny. That basically means that whether they're chained or unchained, they're going to have squares. But there is a 15 out of 65,536 chance of getting the stars, and then there's also a 1 in 65,536 chance of getting the squares. But the stars obviously is what you're going to notice, because if you hit that ridiculous 1 in 65,000 chance of getting squares, you won't even know that you've hit it, because it's exactly the same as, you know, all the other force shinies. But as for the stars, you can potentially hit stars if your previous check also flagged as shiny. That basically means, guys, that you have a 1 in 4,369 shinies chance of actually getting a shiny with sparkles. So that I'll reiterate, that's 4,369 shiny Pokemon found in the wild. One of them is on average gonna have stars. That's how rare stars is. If we go into a little bit further detail, you can basically see that the shiny check, the first shiny check, which, as I said, is mostly irrelevant, becomes relevant if the PID shiny check is also flagged shiny. So that basically means that you need to get essentially 2 shinies back to back. You need to get the shiny from the first check, and you need to get the shiny from the PID check, except the PID check is actually a little bit rarer than the first check. The first check is out of, no, sorry, it's the other way around. The first check is out of 49.6, and then the PID is 4369, or it's something like that. There's basically, because it's 15 out of 65,536, obviously that's 1 in 4,369, which is higher than the 49.6 shiny odds. So it's actually it's rarer than getting 2 shinies back to back, which gives you a 1 in 17,895,424 chance of finding a shiny in the wild with star sparkles. That's 273 times rarer than a shiny female Combee with the 1 in 8,000 odds pre-6th gen. So basically, to find a shiny in the wild with stars instead of squares is pretty much the rarest occurrence in Pokemon, in all of Pokemon. And that's pretty crazy. And as I said, I was just making that video because I saw that A-Drive was basically saying, yo, this is for chain shinies, and I mean that's what Kurt says as well. He says it's for chain shinies, but obviously we have proof that all the shinies we've been finding have squares in the wild, and as it turns out, you know, digging further, it turns out that it's just the PID check, which, you know, is the staple part of shiny Pokemon, is what makes it squares. But obviously it's the first check, that really weird first check, that if matched with the shiny PID will give you stars, potentially. You still also have a 1 in 16 chance of still getting squares, so even if you hit those ridiculous odds, you might still get squares and you would never know. But for non-wild encounters, so basically for static encounters and for raid and egg and gift, you would just have a 15 out of 16 chance of getting stars, and then the squares being 1 in 16, because originally, I don't know if this has been messed up by Game Freak, but originally the stars were actually meant to be more common, but it hasn't worked out that way, because obviously that force check makes it squares. So for anything that isn't wild, stars are more common, but obviously for the wild, the chances of getting stars are astronomical. So anyway guys, I hope this video was helpful. If you have any questions or comments, just leave them there and I'll try and get back to you as soon as possible. And yeah, until next time guys, this is Mind Imitation. Take care.